Welcome back to The Breakdown with me, NLW. It's a daily podcast on macro, Bitcoin, and the big picture power shifts remaking our world. What's going on, guys? It is Friday, November 29th, and today we are talking tariffs. Before we get into that, however, if you are enjoying The Breakdown, please go subscribe to it, give it a rating, give it a review, or if you want to dive deeper into the conversation, come join us on the Breakers Discord. You can find a link in the show notes or go to bit.ly/breakdownpod. All right, friends. Hope you are happy and full coming off of a wonderful Thanksgiving. Since it is a quiet day, we're doing something a little bit different, going a little bit deeper on a very increasingly important topic, which is, of course, tariffs. Basically, we're trying to understand what's actually going on and what the perspectives are beyond all the political bluster, and to figure out what this might mean for all of us, depending on how different policies get enacted. What's for sure is that President-elect Donald Trump has wasted no time wielding the tariff cudgel. In a Monday Evening Truth Social post, Trump raised the threat of tariffs against the nation's closest trading partners and some of its closest allies. For China, Trump threatened an additional 10% tariff on all exports. For Mexico and Canada, the threat was 25%. Trump wrote, "As everyone is aware, thousands of people are pouring through Mexico and Canada, bringing crime and drugs at levels never before seen. Right now, a caravan coming from Mexico composed of thousands of people seems to be unstoppable in its quest to come through our currently open border." Trump pledged to sign executive orders imposing tariffs on day one in office, adding, "This tariff will remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion of our country. Both Mexico and Canada have the absolute right and power to easily solve this long-simmering problem. We hereby demand they use this power, and until such time as they do, it's time for them to pay a very big price." For China, Trump demanded the country implement the death penalty for drug traffickers linked to the fentanyl trade. And it is worth noting that this is a page out of the previous Trump playbook. In May of 2019, Trump threatened a 5% tariff against Mexico, which would escalate if they didn't address border crossings. Mexico complied with the demand, and the tariff was never enforced. In the previous year, the Trump administration imposed a steel and aluminum tariff to address product dumping. It remained in place for a year before being lifted. Juan Carlos Baker, who helped Mexico negotiate the current trade deal with US and Canada, said, "I'm feeling a lot of déjà vu." While Trump has never been shy, clearly, about using the threat of tariffs to achieve policy goals, there is also a clear escalation here. 25% is a massive levy, and to apply it generally across all products is unprecedented in the modern era of global trade. China, Canada, and Mexico combined make up around 40% of US imports. If imposed, they would likely cripple the economies of both nations and drive US inflation much, much higher. But the general read from policy experts is that this is the opening gambit of a negotiation rather than an intended policy. Trump, in this telling, likely doesn't want to impose these tariffs. He wants the neighboring countries to address issues at the border in a hurry. And there are already signs that foreign leaders are getting to work. On Wednesday, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau told the press, "There's work to do and we know how to do it." Mexico President Claudia Sheinbaum took a different tack, calling the tariffs unacceptable due to the job loss and inflation they would cause. She said, "One tariff will follow another and so on until we put our common businesses at risk. Dialogue is the best path to achieving understanding, peace, and prosperity for our two countries. I hope our teams can meet soon." So while maybe slightly tougher talk from Mexico's leader, both are clearly heading for the negotiation table. For policy experts, the analysis is pure game theory. Daniel Tenenbaum, a partner at consulting firm Oliver Wyman, said, "Making these announcements 2 months before you're in power is certainly signaling that you're ready to begin negotiating. We'll have to see what the new administration team actually does as they get on board." Daniel Uczó, a senior trade lawyer at law firm Thompson Hine, said, "The tempo of this will be fast." He called the tariff announcements on Monday night, quote, "tactical and transactional, designed to achieve targeted results." And this, for many, is the point. In the past, Trump hasn't used tariffs as a revenue-raising scheme. They've always been threatened as a way to gain leverage in negotiations. It's a form of economic brinksmanship, but the negotiation tactic worked during his first term. One big question that's new, however, will be how to think about the tactical threat of tariffs and a broader policy goal of shifting the tax burden away from income and towards tariffs. Jan Hatzius, chief economist at Goldman Sachs, said it's important not to conflate the two. On the campaign trail, Trump promised a 60% tariff on China and a 10 to 20% tariff on the rest of the world. That policy seems to be less about tactics and more about long-term strategic goals. The aim appears to be a global realignment, rebalancing trade towards the US, and beginning to charge for access to the world's largest consumer base. Newly selected Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has spoken at length about this tariff strategy. He is in favor of a gradual approach and said he's willing to negotiate with Trump on the final numbers. But that doesn't mean he's in favor of maintaining the status quo. In a January interview, Bessent compared the use of tariffs to sanctions, stating, "I think tariffs for the sake of tariffs aren't interesting, but there's an old Soviet nuclear strategy called escalate to de-escalate. I think with tariffs you can escalate, you can put on tariffs with the idea of getting rid of the tariffs. Tariffs are like sanctions. Why does the US impose sanctions? Because our financial might and the widespread use of the US dollar, we are able to put on sanctions. We can tell the French you can't trade with Iran because we control this, but over time people can leave the dollar if you keep firing that weapon too much. What we're trying to do is make China rebalance. China overmanufactures and they deprive the household sector. They underconsume. So if you push them to rebalance, the identity of that is more US manufacturing. This is a 10-year project. You've got two patients, the US and China. 350-pound, 2-pack-a-day smokers up on the table, and you're not going to throw them on the treadmill. Let's do this slowly, but you want to start moving towards equilibrium, and I think rebalancing could be good for everybody. So is that the right view? Looking at tariffs as a more fine-tuned version of sanctions? To continue the analogy, at a nation-state level, sanctions are akin to the death penalty. Because they are only used in severe cases, once a country hits that threshold, sanctions are rarely removed. For example, Cuban sanctions are still in place more than 30 years after the end of the Cold War. They also, frankly, have a very poor track record of encouraging meaningful change. Tariffs could theoretically be used as a lighter touch version of sanctions. A 10 to 20% tariff doesn't cripple a nation, but it certainly provides a strong incentive to undertake trade rebalancing. Bessent has played with the idea of a tiered system where tariffs are stratified into red, yellow, and green. This would be used to drive policy outcomes and encourage nations to adhere to American values and interests. For example, India might rethink their decision to buy Russian oil if the cost includes an increase in tariffs. Another strategy he has discussed is using the sale of U.S. treasuries as a roundabout way to charge for use of the U.S. defense umbrella. Bessent noted that Japan recently increased their defense spending, following through on a pledge made to the Biden administration. However, the devaluation of the yen meant spending remained flat in dollar terms. Forcing allies to purchase long-maturity U.S. debt could be a way of, quote, paying upfront for the defense guarantee. It could also have the side effect of allowing the U.S. to more easily refinance the debt to a longer maturity. Today's episode is brought to you by BitKey, the hardware wallet built for Bitcoin. Made by the team behind Square and Cash App, BitKey makes securely managing your Bitcoin absurdly simple. BitKey is integrated with partners like Cash App, Coinbase, Robinhood, and Blockchain.com, so you can easily compare prices across exchanges before you buy or sell. And their app works like the money apps you already use because simplicity is the best form of security. Send, receive, and track your wallet value over time all in one place. Time magazine named BitKey one of the best inventions of 2024. Their simple 3-key approach to self-custody replaces complex features like seed phrases that make traditional wallets hard to use and easy to lose. Give the gift of simplified self-custody to the Bitcoin person in your life, and if that's you, get BitKey and sit back and relax while the sats stack. For a limited time, you can get BitKey for $99. That's $51 off the normal price. Get yours today online at Amazon, Best Buy, or bitkey.world. That's bitkey.world. The net of all of this is that there is a rethink of foreign policy happening in a big way for one of the first times since the Cold War. The ideology of insisting allies pay for the benefits they receive from the US and incentivizing enemies to yield to US policy is dramatically different to the laissez-faire free trade era that began in the 90s. However, for many, it's difficult to claim that the free trade era has been a complete success, and it is of course impossible to ignore its disintegration over the past decade. It might be useful to understand not only the policy plans, but the person who's proposing it, and I mean specifically the implementation version. Bessent is largely seen as a macro genius on Wall Street, and while the plan is unorthodox compared to the last 30 years of free trade, it doesn't appear to be unconsidered. In other words, tariff policy could have a clearly defined strategic goal. At a June event, Bessent said, "We are going to have some kind of grand global economic reordering on international trade and relationships. I'd like to be a part of it. I've studied this." Some have suggested that Bessent could seek to moderate Trump's tariff policy. Judging from his policy statements, Bessent was likely the architect of the policy during his time as chief economic advisor to the campaign. Bessent then doesn't seem to want to moderate the tariff policy so much as harness it to bring about a new global order. During a speech last month, entitled "Make the International Economic System Great Again," Bessent said, "President Trump is right that actual free trade is desirable. It might seem counterintuitive from a free market perspective, but he's also right that in order to actually create a freer and more extensive trading system over the long term, we need a more activist approach internationally." Michael Pettis, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment and renowned China expert, seems to agree with the logic. After reading Bessent's speech, he tweeted, "Bessent is right. Those who believe that U.S. trade intervention is introducing distortions into a world of global free trade are completely befuddled. For one thing, a world of global free trade is incompatible with large, persistent, beggar-thy-neighbor trade surpluses. In a well-functioning global trading system, surpluses couldn't persist because they would unleash automatic adjustments that would eliminate imbalances in the surplus economies, thereby reducing the downward pressure their surpluses put on global demand. The fact that policies in the surplus countries prevent these adjustments from happening is prima facie evidence that major surplus economies have been indirectly intervening in trade for decades, while also undermining the global benefits of comparative advantage. This suggests that there are two very different trade strategies for the US. One is to hamper global trade and to turn large economies into autarkic trading blocs. The other is to break up the current global trading system and force it closer to the ideals of free trade. That seems to be Besson's plan, but the fact that economists often can't see the difference between the two strategies shows just how befuddled most of them are on the subject of trade. In other words, escalate to de-escalate. The other key piece of logic underlying Besson's plan to use tariffs to bring about global change is that the design is that the pain shouldn't necessarily be borne by the US consumer. Most reporting is assuming inflation is the clear outcome of tariffs. But during an interview last week, Besson said, tariffs can't be inflationary because if the price of one thing goes up, unless you give people more money, then they have less money to spend on the other thing, so there is no inflation. The inflation comes through either increasing the money supply or increasing the government spending. Still, that signal is a little mixed. Back in January, Besson wrote to his hedge fund investors, tariffs are inflationary and would strengthen the dollar. Hardly a good starting point for a U.S. industrial renaissance. Weakening the dollar early in his second administration would make U.S. manufacturing competitive. A weak dollar and plentiful cheap energy could power a boom. The current Wall Street consensus is for a strong dollar based on the tariffs. We strongly disagree. A strong dollar should emerge by the end of his term if the U.S. reshoring effort is successful. So what we have here sounds like an order of operations problem. Besson will be faced with a choice. Weaken the dollar early to promote domestic manufacturing, or strengthen it to put pressure on the Chinese manufacturing base. There's also a slight contradiction in Besson's thinking in the January note, which might explain the change in later comments. Tariffs might well be inflationary, but a strong dollar would be disinflationary, especially when combined with a boost to oil production. Either way, the point is that it's not as clear a one-to-one correlation between tariffs and inflation as it might at first seem. Ultimately, we don't know what Trump and Besson will do once they take office. What does seem clear is that this will likely be the highest-stakes policy the U.S. Treasury has attempted in several decades. It evokes ideas of the Fourth Turning Thesis and Zoltan Pozar's Bretton Woods III. To carry out this grand scheme, Besson will need to carefully balance policy. He will need the consent of the bond market. We could see currency interventions unlike anything since the 1985 Plaza Accords. Energy policy may need to be deployed as a brake on inflation. Right now, the reporting is assuming that the Trump tariffs are the actions of an angry politician lashing out at the world, that Trump is breaking things just to break them. It seems clear when you dig into Besson's comments that, agree with it or not, there is a coherent strategy being deployed intentionally to reshape the global order. If that is the case, which appears to me to be clear, the much more productive conversation is about how it will work in practice and what the trade-offs and risks really are. I'm sure that is something that we will continue to cover on this show, but for now, hopefully you have a better sense of what's going on and what's going into this policy. Like I said, I hope you're in the middle of a great little holiday weekend. And until next time, be safe and take care of each other. Peace.